Hello everyone and welcome back to the Alberta independence case. Today, we are going to talk about what may be the most important data points so far in the entire debate over Alberta independence. For months, organizations like Alberta Prosperity Project and Stay Free Alberta have been mobilizing supporters under Alberta's citizen initiative process. Their goal has been clear: collect enough signatures to trigger a referendum question on Alberta's independence. And now we finally have a number. According to the organizers, about 178,000 signatures have been collected and will be submitted to Elections Alberta for verification. But here is the key point of today's analysis. This number, 178,000, is the first real measurable data point we have about the level of support the independence movement can mobilize within the Alberta voting population. And when we analyze it carefully, it may actually represent one of the most disappointing statistical outcomes the movement has seen so far. Today we are going to break down why. For months, the debate around Alberta independence has largely taken place in social media spaces, rallies, and political commentary. Supporters of independence have argued that the movement is rapidly growing and that large numbers of Albertans support the idea of becoming an independent country. But until now, we did not have a real-world test of that claim. The citizen initiative petition process provided exactly that test. Because collecting signatures requires something very concrete. People must sign legally, their names must match voter registry signatures, must be verified. In other words, it is a measurable indicator of actual support. And when the numbers finally came in, the movement reported approximately 178,000 signatures. That number matters because the current legal threshold for a constitutional citizen initiative petition in Alberta is about 10% of the votes cast in the last provincial election. That works out to roughly 178,000 signatures. So the independence campaign has essentially reported a number just above the legal minimum requirement. Now this is where the analysis becomes interesting. For months, supporters of independence created a narrative that this petition campaign would far exceed the minimum threshold. Many organizers and supporters spoke openly about collecting 500,000 signatures or even 1 million signatures. The idea was not just to qualify for a referendum. The idea was to send a powerful political signal that Alberta independence had massive grassroots support. There were rallies in major cities like Calgary. There were town halls across the province. There were signature drives in multiple communities. There were even outreach events outside Canada, including gatherings involving supporters in the United States. All of this created the impression that the movement was building extraordinary momentum. But when the final number emerged, 178,000 signatures, it told a very different story. Instead of exceeding expectations by hundreds of thousands of signatures, the number ended up barely clearing the minimum requirement. From a statistical standpoint, that is a massive gap between expectation and outcome. The next factor that makes this result particularly striking is the legal context. When Alberta's citizen initiative legislation was first introduced, the threshold for constitutional initiatives was much higher. Originally, campaigns had to collect signatures equal to 20% of eligible voters from the previous election. That requirement would have meant collecting well over 300,000 signatures. However, legislative changes later aligned the initiative rules with 10% of the votes cast in the last election, which lowered the threshold significantly. That change reduced the requirement to roughly 178,000 signatures. In other words, the legal bar for launching the referendum campaign was lowered for Stay Free Alberta and the Alberta Prosperity Project. Yet even with this lower threshold, the independence petition campaign only managed to reach just above the minimum requirement. If the earlier 20% rule had still been in place, the petition would likely not have qualified at all. That is a critical point, because it shows how narrow the margin actually was. Another important observation is that the signature numbers appear to align closely with public opinion polling that has been conducted over the years. Many polls have consistently suggested that a minority of Albertans support full independence, while a majority prefer reform within Canada. If roughly 178,000 voters were willing to sign an independence petition, that would represent a relatively small share of the overall electorate. That does not mean the movement is insignificant. But it does suggest that the movement's support may be closer to the polling numbers than the online narrative suggested. In other words, the signature count may actually confirm what surveys have been saying all along. Another crucial point that cannot be ignored is that the reported signatures have not yet been verified. They still need to be reviewed by Elections Alberta. During verification, officials will check for duplicate signatures, ineligible signatories, and incorrect information. In previous petition campaigns, verification has often reduced the final valid count. So until the review process is complete, the true number of valid signatures remains uncertain. Even beyond the petition numbers, there are several additional challenges facing the independence movement. One major issue is the question of Indigenous treaty rights. Many First Nations in Alberta are signatories to historic treaties with the Crown. These treaties are constitutionally protected agreements within Canada. Several Indigenous leaders have already raised concerns that they were not consulted about the independence proposal. Those concerns have led to legal challenges. The issue could become a major constitutional barrier. Another factor affecting public perception has been some controversial proposals associated with the independence movement. These include discussions around revisiting immigration status rules, requiring certain groups to undergo re-evaluation processes, altering relationships with the federal government. Whether supporters view these ideas as reform or critics see them as exclusionary, they have contributed to significant political debate. And in a referendum scenario, broad public support is essential. Any policies that alienate large groups of voters can make it harder to build the majority required to win. Another controversial aspect has been discussions by some supporters about potential economic relationships with the United States. In some circles, there has even been speculation about Alberta becoming closely aligned with the U.S. economy. But critics argue that discussing such possibilities before even securing a clear democratic mandate may create political backlash. Because for many Albertans, the first question is not about foreign relations. The first question is simply whether independence itself is supported. So when we step back and look at the big picture, the 178,000 signature figure becomes extremely significant. It is the first measurable test of how much support the independence movement can mobilize through a formal democratic process. And when we compare the result with the expectations that were publicly discussed, numbers like 500,000 or even 1 million signatures, the outcome appears far more modest than many supporters predicted. Even with a lower legal threshold, the campaign appears to have barely crossed the minimum requirement. The signatures still need to be verified. Legal challenges may still emerge. And even if a referendum were eventually held, the independence movement would still need to convince a majority of Albertans to support leaving Canada. That is a very high bar. And the numbers we are seeing today suggest that the path to Alberta independence may be far more difficult than many people initially believed. But this debate is far from settled. So let me ask you directly, do these numbers show that Alberta independence is gaining momentum? Or do they suggest the movement may be much smaller than the online buzz made it appear? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read the comments and I want to hear from both sides of this debate. I will see you in the next video.